welcome in everybody. We have a special simulcast treat for you today. Um, Going out on Navigating Patterns and on Father Eric Site's channel at the same time. And we're going to talk about this wonderful movie that I saw called Nefarious, which is effectively about demon possession. And I thought it was such a good movie that I said, no, we have to talk about this. Like, we have to talk about this. It's too juicy. It's too salient. It's too important, especially to today. And so my sort of thesis for this particular movie is that it makes all of the arguments that these Christian apologists should be making, but aren't. And we can discuss, whether or not that's reasonable or fair or whatever. But the format of this is basically going to be that Castle, who took all these wonderful notes and is our studious and good friend, is going to go through his notes, and Father Eric and I are more or less going to add commentary and help on that side as we're going through the film. And so, with that, Castle, take it away.
Absolutely. So these notes were taken during my second watch through. They were done chronologically as I was watching the movie, and any notes that I had that related to earlier on, I put in those sections. So as I present these, this will be totally, especially because this is branded as a movie review, this is going to be a full on, like, total spoiler review, like actually everything probably.
And so, if you haven't seen Nefarious yet, just stop the stream, go find it. It's available on many streaming platforms, and then you can come and pick up the conversation when you're done, because it's probably the best movie that's ever been made for $1 million.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's amazing just how this movie maintains your attention despite most of it just being two guys sitting in a room talking for like an hour. So yeah, extremely well done. Could definitely be done on stage if people were so inclined. And I think these people were stage actors as well, in their careers. So it makes sense. So, but yeah, for sure. Also, still really good for me the second watch through and everything. So we're just going to kind of go through here. And just kind of pick up. So at the very beginning, we have this psychologist that is in his office in the evening, and we see there's kind of like the subtle movement of his, I think it's his degree that he has framed on the wall that keeps on kind of becoming just very, very slightly off center. And it's really kind of catching his attention every time he kind of comes around. He adjusts it multiple times. And then we see him enter into an elevator, and then soon after we see him fall down in front of on the other side of the window of his office, and then we see the degree, which was again misadjusted, then kind of go back into order again. And so this kind of reminded me fairly recently. There's a professional exorcist, the Father Dan Rehill mentioned. They have like this little acronym where they call it LBDB, or sorry. LDBD, which is Little Demon Big Drama. And so it's this thing of like just the kind of constant little nagging, almost like mood slime situation where you don't really kind of address something or you don't recognize something as an issue. And then next thing you know, the person winds up taking drastic measures thinking, oh, this is what life is like. Or, you end up in that sort of horizontal flat world sort of mindset of, oh, this is just what life is like. This is completely unbearable, and not this is desolation or this is an outright attack or something like that.
Mm-hmm. With the evil one always attempting to convince you that the way you feel right now under my influence is the way that you'll always feel. There's no escape, and therefore whatever comes after that, give in to your temptations, whatever they are.
Yeah. And, so I don't know exactly how much, I'll just give a kind of a recent example. There was an example of a guy, somebody that I know, knew, who unfortunately, he had kind of gone down this path of kind of choosing worse options and stuff like that, wound up divorcing his wife and all these things. And this wound up culminating over the course of like a year and a half in suicide, like fairly recently. So, for anybody out there, keep them, just as an intention. But this is one of those things that people don't realize, that you have this guy like the psychologist in the movie who's very well established, well esteemed, and everything. It's very obviously working in a really nice office and a well placed area. And yet, he winds up being completely overcome by these things, despite all of his learning and even structure of his day to day life. And then it cuts after that to we're now seeing the new psychologist, who is going to be our sort of main non-possessed character that is going to be in the movie. And what's interesting about the way that we enter into the scene is that a lot of times with movies you'll hear like a radio chatter or something like that to give you some background of what's going on. But if you look, he's actually listening to the radio that we're listening to as he's driving in. And so he comes in listening to the radio where all of the people talking are saying, "Oh, why is this guy still drawing breath? Why is this guy still alive?" Referencing the death row inmate that he's going to psychologically evaluate as to whether or not he's insane and can't stand execution, or if he's competent enough to be condemned.
Right, and I think it's worth sort of highlighting, since I didn't know if you were going to sort of jump forward or not, but yeah. It's worth highlighting. There's been a number of psychologists, we find out later, right? And that's actually significant. And I think, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I think, so I watched it once, but the minute I watched it, that psychologist who commits suicide is in the movie for like 10 seconds. Like, it's very short time that he's on screen, because most of it is set and setting. Just to establish the authority and the order. But to me, it screamed Jordan Peterson to me immediately. Like, he's tall, lanky, had that Peterson look to him. So, what did you think, Father? Did you think it looked like Peterson?
Well, to be clear, I watched this like when it came out, and I haven't rewatched it because I've been having a very busy season in my life. And I didn't have the bandwidth to rewatch this. But I think, regardless if that was done on purpose or not, a mature Catholic assessment of Dr. Peterson, which, after having been around people talking about him and engaged with a fair amount of his material, is that he doesn't give you the complete package. He gives you some useful tools, and we can all be very thankful for the good that he's accomplished, and we don't have to disparage that. But he's definitely not the complete package, and that's like kind of one of the fundamental limits of psychology, and it's insofar as it really is a science, it's limited to the scientific method, and the scientific method just describes at best how something might work. It doesn't give you any tools to deal with like real evil. It doesn't, because ultimately real evil is kind of pulling everything towards destruction. It doesn't want to build anything up. It's ultimately a self-destructive. And when you just have a heap of things, science really can't tell you anything much about it. It wants, like, the interesting and useful science is all about things that are working properly, and what can we do with the things that are working properly. A heap of destroyed matter is scientifically uninteresting and just chaotic. So science doesn't have the tools to deal with real evil that comes at a layer higher than science exists at.
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, one of the things we'll say that Peterson certainly provides, in my opinion, is order as such, right? It's an ordered way of understanding material. And the reason why it can't deal with possession, demons, whatever you want to call it, right? It's technically, even though they hate this term, it's technically correct, the supernatural, right? The things that are beyond or above natural. It's because it only deals with ordered things, and evil is the disorderment of things. It's not entropy. That's a little bit different, right? But it is the disorderment of things. And that's why science has such a hard time going down that road, because, you know, the scientists know full well, at least unconsciously, that they don't have any tools for this. They've got tools for all kinds of things, but none of these things. Their tools are completely ineffective, and in fact, they're counterproductive. And that was one of the things that I, you know, sort of liked about this this particular film was that it really demonstrates that. This is what I meant when I said earlier, like, yeah, the Christian apologists should just watch this movie and just rip off the lines and be done with it, because it's far more effective than anything they've been doing.
Yeah, it really is interesting just how well this movie conveys so many concepts, even kind of implicitly, but there's a lot of explicit stuff going on here. And so that was one of the things, just the last of the kind of initial implicit bit, is that there are protesters protesting the death penalty of this man outside. The psychologist barely gives them any attention, whereas he's been listening to the radio, which is skewed in a particular direction this entire time. And then one of the first things he says, as he goes and meets with the warden, is that everyone deserves an impartial review. But he's already gone in with a particular framing. And we start to see later on that his general kind of disposition on life is one that kind of has a lesser value for the continuation of life if it becomes inconvenient, these sorts of things. So we can tell that he's definitely not an impartial man.
Right.
And so, yeah, I'll leave some of those elements afterwards. But then we get introduced to the next kind of recurring character. So we've got the warden, who, you know, throughout the movie, we don't see a huge amount of kind of precise discernment. But because of his experience and the structure that he operates in and everything, he's able to kind of discern well enough to get the job done. And he's also able to discern well enough that James, the psychologist here, is not exactly up to the task. You know, even goes and says at one point that you spend enough time with this guy, he's going to convince you that you did the murders and everything. And so he warns him. He doesn't know what the actual diagnosis of the issue is. He just knows evil, therefore execute. And that, you know, within the context of his job is correct. Although, you know, you also have the kind of moral dilemma that's going on here. But as far as executing his purposes, he's doing everything he should. And he even goes off to say, you know, but the problem with you shrinks is that you're too smart for your own good. So a lot of this kind of not relying on the structure, all this, you know, as you said, the kind of relativism of, you know, once you're not in the structure of the scientific method, you wind up getting kind of this exploded out, like extreme peripheral of, you know, well, you know, we can't measure that, and therefore there's not, you know, this is also not something of substance per se. And then so as soon as we get introduced to Edward, or more so Nefarious possessing Edward, he goes and cuts off James and just starts rattling off everything he knows about his professional career and the schooling and everything. And so there's a bit of this kind of knocking him off balance, already just kind of, you know, expressing his sort of dominance in the situation, while also explicitly pointing out that he manipulated the previous psychologist and was himself responsible remotely for the suicide. And that the entire point was to get this meeting to happen. So just kind of pointing out that, okay, yeah, all of this is planned. You're here because I invited you, you know, that kind of like, oh, I'm sure you're wondering why I called you here type of thing.
It's like an upside down parody of divine providence right there. What Nefarious pulls off, you know, for his own evil purposes there.
Yeah. And I want to sort of highlight real quick. So we've got the three main characters at at this point, or is it four? So that's what we're here to discuss. And you've got sort of the good on one side and the bad on the other, or the evil on the other, however you want to frame that. But the nice thing is that you have that third point of contrast, which is the warden. And the warden acts as a neutral agent acting within a system who he's not dismissive of the psychologist at all, right? But he's also not revering him. He's not dismissive of the prisoner at all, right? His attitude is, well, this is the system and this is how it works. And here's danger, by the way, right? So he's very tuned to the danger of this guy, which the psychologist obviously is not. Right? Mm-hmm. And so that third point of contrast within the movie is really everything, because what happens is most of it, as Castle mentioned, is two people locked in a room, right? And there's the sort of that good and evil aspect to it, with evil saying, no, you're really evil like me, effectively. But then we get pulled out a few times to go back to the warden. And the warden is just like, listen, this is the system and this is how the system works, and let's get this done, right? Like, let's let the system do what the system does, because the system, he's not even making a good evil appeal. He's saying, this is how the system's supposed to work. It looks to me like the system's doing the right thing. So let's let it do its thing, which, for me was really important, right? Because it shows, people will throw around ridiculous terms because they can't look up words and find out where they came from, like egregore, right? Or they got a new one, hyperobject, and more nonsense words, more nonsense made up words. But in this case, you see the utility of having a distributed cognition through time, the prison system, right? Which is tied to the judicial system, but isn't the same system, right? It's just kind of a sub part of it or something. How those things interact in light of good and evil to highlight the difference, right? The differences there. And so I just wanted to add that flavor in there, because that's one of the things that makes this movie work so well, aside from the fact that it's fantastically well acted. It's not like it has award-winning CGI, because
$1 million movie here. $1 million movie. Mostly just two guys in a dank room.
But yeah, for the most part. So anyway, Castle, please take us further.
Yeah. So at this point, you have the kind of introductions here. There's kind of a comical point where James is trying to present himself as doctor. And this kind of gets into what I think was a really major theme in the movie, is this thing of identity and relationship. It comes up a lot throughout the movie. And so he talks about wanting to be called, what was his last name? Murphy? Martin, yeah, that he wanted to be called Dr. Martin, and that Nefarious just completely outright refuses, except on the condition of being called Lord High Prince, which he's not going to do. And then from that point on, it's just nonstop diminutives. Like, he talks him down really quick to Jimmy, and he doesn't do anything about it. But when he's trying to assert his position as Dr. Martin, he says that it preserves the nature of the relationship. And he conceded that ground immediately, but he at least kind of tried to present that. So I think I'm not going to go too much further into that relationship bit just yet, because it keeps on coming up. So I don't want to beat it down now. But then he goes and he talks about his name. So he goes and he talks about Nefarious, but really it's Nefariamus, and he's talking about that it's one who possesses the fullness of the trait. And then Jimmy at this point goes and says that it's not a name, and Nefarious asserts that once somebody uses it, it becomes a name, referencing Simon Petros. No one was called Rock before that point, and so there's this important bit of the participation also with the identity that kind of solidifies it. And so, it's almost like the in that movie Inglourious Bastards, where in the beginning where he says, I love my unofficial title precisely because I've earned it, type of thing. And so you have a similar sort of scenario here with the demon, where it's like, yes, this is my name, and also I earned it, and he also makes kind of further reference to this near the end of the movie, not explicitly, but just kind of through his deeds. And then you start to see a little bit more of the kind of game, which Jimmy at this point does not. but you start to see a little bit of the game that he's playing where the entire meeting has been arranged. Like this was all a long time coming. And he knew exactly how things were going to go. And so he pulls him into this little temptation of, laughing to himself and then saying, "Oh, I have a secret." Right. And he kind of baits him into wanting to know, like, what is the secret knowledge that you have? He reveals, okay, you're going to be responsible. You will have been responsible for 3 murders by the end of today, which he, of course, immediately rejects. And then he goes into this kind of, brief, arrogant, demonic monologue of "it'll happen because I say so," type of thing, and that demons don't have beliefs; they know all of these things. And I think that was another really important theme to this movie, is that you take the demon who knows that God is real, knows the difference between good and evil. He knows what natural and divine law is. He knows more. He boasts that he knows more theology than any human being that ever lived. He knows all the history because he was there, right? Like there's all of these different things. And yet it makes no difference to the fact that, being condemned to hell, he's still level 0 basically. And yet he possesses all those traits. It doesn't mean that those things aren't goods, but just that his participation in his identity as the one who possesses the fullness of nefariousness kind of invalidates all of the other things that could be considered goods of this learning and understanding and theology and everything like that, because he's just using it all for evil. Like he's using it to subvert.
And if I was watching this as a Catholic priest, I have all sorts of Catholic priest knowledge and backgrounds, and you watch this and you're like, oh yeah, this is basically like an image of a completely botched exorcism here. Because like the first thing that I'm not an exorcist, but I kind of know how it works just through my studies. And first thing that the exorcist goes and does is he just controls the environment. He uses his priestly authority to bind everything. And, if you've got Jesus Christ backing you up, like all the spirits are going to get twisted into pretzels and they can't do anything. But you have to go in there and like name and claim all of that authority over all of the space that you're working with, over all of the people there. And you gotta, and it's kind of a tedious like list of prayers, but these demons are all very legalistic, and you've got to like hit every single little point. Otherwise, they'll grab onto whatever they can and try and wrest it away from you. So our buddy Jimmy Martin here is completely unable to see this happening, because his only authority is the authority of science. And as we've discussed, science has its utility and its place. But when we're dealing with this, you need like a higher power to come in and keep you safe. And so, immediately, Nefarious is just absolutely running the table here. It's like I don't remember, this might be like 10 years ago now, a Super Bowl where the Denver Broncos were playing the Seattle Seahawks. And on the very first snap of the drive, the Seahawks sacked Peyton Manning and just ran the game after that. This is basically like the Exorcist version of that very unfun to watch Super Bowl, because it was all so entirely one-sided. This, at least, is fun to watch.
Fair enough.
Well, yeah, and that idea of the name helping to establish the relationship. And then you think about naming and proper naming versus improper naming, and proper claims versus improper claims, right? You can't just assign something a name and then determine what that is independently, right? You're supposed to be looking at the Platonic essence or something, right? You're supposed to be figuring out the final cause, the telos or something. You're supposed to be adjusting the way you talk to the thing, not trying to magic it and say, well, I'm just going to use this term. And then in that sequence that Castle outlined in the beginning, what he's doing is he keeps changing the name to downgrade the relationship on one side, to increase his relationship, and downgrade Jimmy's relationship down to pretty much nothing, right? And so part of his control is about the naming. In fact, his way of taking control first involves, I'll use your title if you use mine, but I have a better title, basically, right? And so he's got the scientific corner nailed. Like, the scientific corner can't win that battle because it can't have such a grandiose title, which wouldn't make any sense anyway.
I mean,
right?
yeah, I don't know. I think holding the Stephen P. Johnson chair of biology is pretty impressive. I don't know.
I don't know who Stephen P. Johnson is, but
I made that up. But didn't it sound impressive?
it really did. It really did not, because I don't. Appeals to authority don't work with me. That's for sure. So, yeah, and that the way of, so he's already knocked out, like, your system sucks, right? And then he just carries him down into this personal, degraded, low res version of his identity that is only works and would only be appropriate to somebody he grew up with, right? To somebody with an enormous amount of context, right? Calling somebody by effectively their nickname or their shortened first name is something that is typically reserved for family and very close friends for a reason, right? And that is his way of putting him in his place, right? And keeping him at the bottom, even though, and feigning at the same time a very personal relationship, right, Jimmy? Yeah. So it's really clever the way that's done. And we're living in a place and a time where people don't take naming seriously. Everyone's a postmodern, and so they think they can just author not only their own characters and their own stories, but their own names. And you can't do that. That ain't gonna work. But it is gonna have bad results for everybody, yourself included. And so, could you please not? That's my only ask there.
Yeah, I think after this point, he kind of breaks into, or just the writers in general kind of broke into, let's give them C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters in 10 minutes or less. And they do it exceptionally well. Like, I have to admit, I enjoyed my reading of Screwtape Letters, but also you could just watch about that 10-minute bit and just get all of it right there. And maybe even a little bit more explicitly, which, the point of the book was not necessarily to be fully explicit, but he goes into this kind of monologue again of how the possession actually worked, and that it isn't just kind of an instantaneous thing. And he gives the example of how he sort of got Edward, saying that it requires a series of yeses. And like, I've harped on this before, but the concept of malice being just choosing the lesser good over the greater good. I mean, that's kind of like one of the major mechanisms of how backsliding works. And so, and not enough no's. So he said, we'll give them a series of temptations of varying duration and intensity, and then it just kind of spirals from there. And eventually, they have full subjugation of them. But one of the really important points of that is that he emphasizes that the absence of baptism in Edward allowed influence before the age of reason, which is the age of 7. So he even says, that the theft of a toy car at the year of 3 was the end. And so this is one of those things of just the kid had actually no defense at all. And later on, he eventually, unpossessed temporarily Edward describes his childhood as short. So there's a clear sort of lack of formation there. Even going into the prison, Dr. Martin at that point still gets the information that Edward has no family. And yet we also have some of the exposition later that Edward didn't kill his family like some serial killers did. And so that's actually kind of like almost another point of kind of dominance that Nefarious tries to kind of push as we get a little bit more backstory on Jimmy there. And then, and after that, the gift of a family member giving a Ouija board, which you could buy at Toys R Us, these sorts of things are all also kind of examples of, well, was that family member completely not under the influence, right, of these sorts of things? Like, it's a lot of people that are kind of subject to the game of this thing that, says that he can't be in multiple places at once, but he can totally jump from one place to another. So later on, he says, well, I spend most of my time with Edward, but when I'm not with him, I'm with you, right? And so you also get some of this thing of like, well, Jimmy was also spending a lot of his time being educated a certain way. And so who knows how much of that was Nefarious, influencing him to be educated wrong as a joke. And also to make him easier to manipulate later. And then so he also says, that while doing these temptations, they can intuit whether or not they've gotten your consent at any particular point, and then that they also appreciate patience. So there's a lot of this kind of like, okay, we're gonna just kind of like hammer you for a really long time. There's more of that kind of LBDB situation, and then you have and then as soon as that ends, it's like, oh, I'm out of it, and they're like, okay, nice, we got another box ticked off and everything, will come back later and everything once he thinks that everything is fine, which I think is relevant to also much later in the movie, but I don't want to keep on harping unless you guys have anything.
Certainly. Like you read the New Testament, you get the sense that people were just possessed more back then. And, you look around nowadays and, a great number of people are still just kind of habitually baptized, even if the parents aren't terribly devout or good at inculcating the children of the faith. But, the mark of that baptism is still a useful thing because, to put it in navigating patterns kinds of language, once you're baptized, you're participating in the life of Christ and in the church, even though you don't have use of your reason or very often much use of your arms yet. And that's still a useful thing there. So making that point about the lack of baptism, making things much more difficult. And it always, you always end up through these things. It's always a matter of you consenting to these things. Before we get too deep into this, it's just useful to remember that a good priest could have saved Edward. Yeah.
Right.
And there's a little bit of Hollywood here and like having Edward and Nefarious kind of locked in together. But we could talk about the scene where the priest does show up when we get there. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more.
We will.
Yeah, no, that'll be part of it. I just want to pause real quick and read some of these comments. So Sandy's asking if any of us have read Malachi Martin, People of the Lie, which apparently is about baptism in the Age of Reason, which I would just quickly connect to. I have of course not read the book. I have a really good idea what's going on there, though. Right, I would quickly connect that to the Age of Gnosis, where propositions are the highest value. I wonder where that comes from, right? And so being able to reason is a propositional sort of engagement, and I'm not a fan. Castles, have you read that?
So there's a little bit of theological and pastoral context about the Age of Reason that might be useful. So first off, it's like a technical term. It's when you start to have the capacity to choose between good and evil, right? Like, so it's not merely about chaining propositions together, because 3-year-olds can actually chain propositions together. There's like at what point, and so around the wisdom of the church is that by age 7, just about everybody who's going to hit the Age of Reason will have hit it. So you could hit it earlier. And I have a professor in seminary who insisted that all of his children had use of their reason by age 4 because they were all so brilliant, and he's probably correct, actually. None of us argued with him. So that's a useful thing there. So there's a certain sense of agency when you get to the Age of Reason, and that's when you start learning how to go to confession, because your sins are now kind of starting to count a little bit more. And you need to do that. Malachi Martin. I've heard a few things about him, but I've never actually read any of his books. They're kind of like fiction, but are they really fiction? Is that actually what's going on over at the Vatican? So
can't tell.
Yeah.
Mm.
So anyway, that's just a useful little bit about the Age of Reason. It's got a little bit more than just, logic.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point for the folks at home, and I think also just to Sandy's credit, the two different comments were separate thoughts,
Different, yeah.
but that kind of going into this exact same topic, then you get this kind of trying to get some words in on the part of Jimmy there saying like, well, this would have an effect on me, except that I'm an atheist, this kind of like, oh, I'm protected by my sort of my beliefs or my sort of situation of my education or what have you. My formation or lack thereof protects me from the consequences of whatever sort of thing. And there's some of that like knowledge is power type of thing where, as we kind of go through, obviously he has actually zero advantages this entire movie. And whatever he did have just gets stripped from him. And then he pulls in the priest. So he pulls in this guy who, far from Jimmy being talked down from Dr. Martin, flat out comes in and says, well, you can just call me Lewis or Lou. And like he starts with that, right? And so he's got the extreme anchor on his own side. And despite that, Nefarious is completely scared out of his mind of the priest just by his very presence. And I like this just kind of, and I'll also pause after this comment because I'm sure that there will be just a little bit of discussion here, but it's a little bit of this kind of exemplification, even though it's a fictional movie, of the invalidity of donatism, which was this thing of like, a priest has to be, strictly speaking, very holy and, sort of orthodox minded in order to be able to properly administer sacraments or perform his duties. Whereas this is a guy who's very clearly ignorant of reality and also not very holy, because if you were actually on the spiritual life, you'd encounter some resistance pretty quick. And yet he seems to be completely convinced that, oh, we've moved beyond these ideas of, demons, and it's more psychological and everything. And Nefarious very quickly calms down and is even kind of buddy with the priest. Yeah, so I'll stop there for a second.
Or kind of feigning that anyway.
Right.
And I just wanted to I wanted to jump in here first, Father, and just say, the idea that you can declare yourself an atheist and therefore cut off yourself from creation, right, from any possible creator, because you don't believe, right? And so, right, that's actually implied. It's an implicit. It has to be true, right? Once you say you're an atheist, and then because you said it, it's true. Like that happened to you, and that's all this age of gnosis nonsense. And I want to highlight what our good friend Gustav's here says. The shrink has lived in a world that has shut out demons, right? By declaring themselves atheists, as though that's a thing you can do, right? Here he runs face into a demon, breaking everything he thinks about the world in every way. And the best spell he can come up with is, I'm an atheist, effectively. And then I would argue the priest, the so-called pastor or whatever doesn't help the situation.
Yeah, and it's interesting what they did. You can, like, I'm watching this movie and I'm like, oh yeah, that's how that would work. That's how that would work. They obviously were consulting with a Catholic exorcist. It's like, it's clear as day. And the Catholic exorcist probably had some frustrations about Father Lou, right? Because if you've been Catholic long enough, you've met Father Lou before, and best case scenario, he doesn't do quite as much damage as he might, but like this flattening that of the spiritual life and flattening of our intellects that would happen in the 1970s, that has an effect, and you end up with Father Lou. But you can see that the character of his priesthood is still respected there, that even though he's like ignorant of his power, right? He's ignorant of his power that he was given when the bishop laid hands on his head and gave him consecration, ordination as a priest. That power's there, And I think Nefarious's relief is genuine because it's sort of like, 600-pound silverback gorilla walked into the room and then, just wasn't going to do anything to you and made it clear that it wasn't going to do anything to you, where it could have like come in and just started, throttling him there. Yeah, it's an interesting, like, it's almost like a commentary on the failure of the church in certain places where, like you could have come in and you could have, like, even if you didn't exercise the guy yourself, because like I would look at that and say, yep, I'm going to need some backup. Like, I'm not going to jump straight into this. I'll say some prayers and I'll get Father so-and-so on the line and the deliverance team, and we'll come back when we're properly equipped to deal with this guy, because he'll run circles around me if I don't come in with a certain amount of care there. But that's still a pretty good plan. And like the way Father Lou ends up leaving is just like really pathetic.
Yeah.
I'll pray for you, and then just leaves, just runs away.
Right.
When like this is the only guy in the prison who had the power to do something about what was going on here.
Right.
So it's a pretty harsh commentary. But if you've been Catholic long enough, you've met Father Lou before, and the only nice thing I can say is that generation is passing out of ministry. So.
Wow, that's pretty hard. And yeah, you get you get back into this idea that, well, if I just let you call me Lou, we'll be closer somehow. Like we'll be buddy, or you'll open up to me. It's this false intimacy. It's this false sense of intimacy. This is part of the intimacy crisis, right? Like, I'll just use your first name, and now all of a sudden we can talk candidly because I used your first name. And I was like, naming is really important. That's not how that works. And maybe you can be slightly upgraded, we'll say, from, Father Eric to Eric or something under certain specific circumstances. But that has to be negotiated over time after starting in the right place with the title, right? Mm-hmm. It's Mr. Lefevre, right? It's that idea. And this whole loss of the hierarchy, you can see it when, and you see this less now, but oh, Mr. So-and-so, that's what they called my father. Like, I don't want to be like my father. Sort of, what? Right? That's destruction of the hierarchy right there. And it gets snuck in the same way that this movie highlights, right, at the societal level, we'll call it, or the cultural level. We snuck in this misnaming, this undernaming, and skipping the whole process of going through this formal way of interacting. And, someday somebody will write a book on manners and that will fix everything. Castle and I are working on it. That's one more book to go at least. So yeah, it gets highlighted again with the priest.
And I like the point of the sort of like, no, that was my father. Like, I don't know if you've seen, and I know it's a joke, but it further kind of damages of like, oh, like Mr. Roberts is my dog, right? Like they like further push the thing down. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. Like you look at kind of even these historical examples, like you've got with because the priest is a higher creature, like by the sacrament of holy orders. Like that is, in a certain sense, like he still has his human nature, but like he's elevated.
He's got additional hierarchical graces. Yeah, additional graces and charisms. Yeah.
And so you look at these examples, like which I highly recommend to the folks at home. But you've got like the Diary of Saint Faustina, where in history there was only 3 or 4 times that a seraphim angel was ever like recorded as being seen, and she had one of those and asked this, because they're the highest one, like they're literally on fire because of proximity to God, and they're totally fine, they're just warm and cozy, but but she asks him to hear her confession and she says, no, only your priests have that authority. And there's that example of like this angel, which is the actual highest possible nature, naturally speaking below God, is saying, no, I don't even have that authority. And so, yeah, I mean, it just to kind of give some contrast of how much of a travesty it is to concede that much territory. is just not good.
So Father Lou snatches defeat from the jaws of victory.
Exactly. And then there's even kind of the mockery, but also the foreshadowing that happens too, where possessed Edward is yelling, will you be available until the sizzle, referring to the electric chair, because Father Lou says that he would still be available, and he wasn't. Like, we watched the movie, like, he was not. He completely bailed. There was no availability there whatsoever. And as soon as he leaves, like, somehow Jimmy is pretty convinced that, oh well, actually that went pretty well. And he was like, do you actually believe that poser? Is like pretty much the first thing that Nefarious says. And then we get into this thing which should honestly make just about anyone cringe if they saw it, which is that to prove that Nefarious is actually a demon, Jimmy invites him in like 4 times.
Yes. Worst possible idea. I was like, oh, that's not, like, I was like tensing up when I saw that. I was like, no.
Yeah. And like, to triple and quadruple down. And then, and he goes and he's like, well, I guess you didn't do anything. And then there's that statement of, I got exactly what I wanted. Right. And there was that thing of like, okay, I baited you. And he even does it of, oh, you have to give me something in return. And I don't remember if that is the point where Nefarious says, like, James, I think I love you. You have a lot of these very kind of like filial statements that are being made between abuse, right? So you've got like the abuse, and then you've got, oh, now here's a term of endearment, or here's the nicknames or whatever.
It's just because he knows he's going to eat them.
Yeah,
it's like talking to a slice of pizza. Oh, you're looking so good right now.
Yeah, and that whole naming thing comes up. I just want to quickly read Gustav's. I had a priest that wanted to be called by his first name. I think he didn't want to feel the distance from his flock. Intimacy crisis, right? He was still fairly serious though, and I think that and that's going to get demonstrated, or did get demonstrated in this movie. It'll be demonstrated, as we talk more about the movie. Time frame matters, right? And you don't want to compress that. Like, that's the dangerous thing. Sometimes you have to, or whatever, but that's a dangerous thing to do. And no, Gustav, the sizzle was not hell. The sizzle was right up until the moment that they, fry him, basically. And I think that, although it does have that double meaning at that level, I think that's important to keep in mind, because one of the themes that this movie can highlight, if you're careful enough and you can watch it well enough, which maybe many people can't, which is partly why we're doing this, is that time frame. Things unfold slowly over time. And those unfolding moments where you do things like say, go ahead, demon, come on in, those are significant, but they're not explosions. But that doesn't mean the explosion wasn't inevitable with the click, right? So you do the click and you're like, see, nothing blew up. And it's like, yeah, but what's the timer on that? Like, how long does the fuse take? Because you lit the fuse, you moron. Like, what? And the movie actually, on several levels, demonstrates this to the audience rather clearly. And not just explicitly by going through as the castle went over earlier, the childhood. It started because he wasn't baptized, and then it moved forward because of the Ouija board, and then it, on and on and on, right? It also demonstrates it with this particular scene, which is, this is the lighting of a fuse, and then he goes, oh well, nothing happened, so haha, right? He's sort of a little bit smug about the fact that nothing happened, and of course the demon's putting on a show, like, oh, you're right, it doesn't work. So I'm like, what? And it's so, honestly, so well acted. The whole thing is so well done. These actors deserve every award ever, and no one else deserves any award ever. It was so good. It was just so good. Anyway, go ahead, Castle.
So after that ridiculous stunt that he pulls, then we get a little bit of we get Jimmy's reward that he asked for in exchange for just control over his body, basically. So it's just like what cost benefit analysis was not performed there. But he goes and he wants to be able to speak to unpossessed Edward, which again, coming from the psychological perspective, it's just like, well, like you don't even think that possession is even a real thing. And it was super easy also.
Castle, just to interject, that's actually their strategy with what they're now calling borderline personality disorder, which is dumb. The DSM-3 had it right. It's multiple personality disorder. And that is the strategy, is to ask to speak to the other personality. And that was his in to do it. So if you understand a little bit about the psychology, of course, that's what he'd do. Like that is actually what they would do, because if they don't believe, it makes total sense to do that.
Yeah. And then at this point, he gets a little bit of a conversation with unpossessed Edward, or more so short leash Edward. And he makes the statement through a lot of stammering that sometimes smart people have a hard time believing stuff that everyone else knows. And you have a bit of this kind of like, eventually the amount of time to talk is cut off after getting a little bit of background of what he is like, and how he says that he didn't actually consent to these murders, and that he did things he was guilty of that he wasn't proud of, but he was not himself guilty of the murders, and that a lot of times in this possessed relationship, while possessed, he'll perform actions, and then Nefarious will abandon him to experience the consequences in Technicolor, while he's off, hanging out with Jimmy, basically. And then he repossesses him, and then you have this conversation about how Jimmy had essentially cut off life support, or done the euthanasia of his elderly mother, who also had a pretty substantial inheritance that he was going to receive, something like $3.5 million or something like that. And he says just 10 years ago you would have been convicted of murder for having done that. So there's a lot of this kind of like relativistic mindset that Jimmy has. He gets very emotional, but eventually he comes back to the table, apologizes for losing his professional demeanor, and then goes. And Nefarious says, "Oh, are you ready for round 2?" And he says, "Oh, I didn't realize this was a fight." And he said, "That's why you're losing." So it's just like the lines and the banter are fantastic, but also, just not being aware that, oh, this is actually what the relationship, or the arena that I'm currently engaged in is. And it's like, well, if you're not even aware that, oh, I'm swimming and therefore there's water and everything, like if you haven't even gotten to that point, then you're just going to drown. He's completely unprepared. And then, some of these other themes that come up are ones that were already kind of echoed there about knowing more theology. And then he goes and he gives kind of this more theologically rich background of creation and salvation history, which he also does not only begrudgingly, but even kind of with more kind of humiliation to Jimmy, saying, "Oh, you wouldn't understand it, and I'll use small words, try to keep up." Before going into it, and, it's tough because you have this thing where it's so well acted that you're almost kind of like enjoying the interaction, even though this is a very evil character, and just kind of shows just how much charisma there is.
Yeah, Nefarious has got like a fair amount of charisma through all of this, and like Jimmy's, like it's brilliantly acted by whoever was playing Jimmy, because he's like got like this, like the stern, but like understanding and a look on his face, but you just get the sense that it's hollow, and like being able to act that, it's just, that's why it's a really good movie, because it's he's like trying to project this confidence, but like there's something inside that's really eating at him. I've met people like that before. It's fascinating that you could get that on camera. So.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, because if I recall correctly, the plan was outlined completely by the demon right up front. Like, no, I want him to die. I don't want you to save him at all, because it's your turn. Like I'm tired of this one. He's got to get going, and and we've got to move forward, and it puts the psychologist guy in an interesting pinch, right? Because like what he doesn't have a way to deal with this. Like what does this mean that I'm supposed to sign the death order, right? But you can see the demon every time it might go not that way, he intervenes, like every time. Which that it's just one of those little subtleties that that people miss, right? It would be easy to miss, especially in a movie like this. It's so engrossing when you're watching it. It's really hard to sort of step back and pay attention to the larger picture.
Yeah. And there's a line that's said here pretty soon after, where Jimmy is asking him kind of some of these theological questions, and he asks, is hell a place or a state? And Nefarious just says flatly yes. And so this is one of those things where if you ever experienced the thing of like, oh, this guy at work or at school or whatever makes my life hell, right? Like this is kind of, imagine everyone in a particular place is like that, and you were manifesting hell there, right? Like that's pretty much what's going on. And then just imagine that's you just put all of those people in one place. I mean, this is, some people probably experience that in a workplace where maybe 80% of the people are like that. And it's just like, oh yeah, this is hell on earth. And it's like, actually, yes, it is. Like in a certain sense, it kind of is. And then he kind of goes through the creation and salvation history, talks about the different wills, the free will of the rational creatures. And then, to kind of accept or reject God's will. And a bit of this kind of, the demonic psychology of like, well, we chose ourselves because that's kind of, it's like a bait and switch to have a will and then not be able to go and exercise it on every hedonistic thing that you want. As opposed to kind of like nesting them, like a while back in one of the Discord chats, I had made the the comment of, that you imagine that you're on like a safari or something like that, and that the will or the wish or the desire, because they're all etymologically connected, of the safari guide is for you to keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times, and to not step out of the vehicle, and that you get through the safari safely and then go back home where there's not any lions or tigers or whatever kind of nonsense that's out there. And then you decide, no, I'm going to do what I want to do. It's just like, okay, well, that's great and everything. And technically you can, that is certainly an option. And so you kind of get a little bit of this kind of difference between, okay, what does that look like for, the man, Edward, who kind of gradually gave his will over, again, still nested in something else, right? Like there's still some other thing that it's embedded in, and that thing eventually starts breaking his fingers in the movie, so like that decision was made. And then you also get this point, and I think this just comes back to the naming thing of that, after sin, the man as king over nature became slaves of to nature by sin. And so you have this thing of like the inversion of the hierarchy, and then you also have like, that's kind of the mechanism by which Nefarious is kind of getting the upper hand consistently in the interaction, or at least at the very beginning, just kind of does it really quickly by naming. And then now it's like, okay, basically everything is above you now. And so now like you're just subject to all of this. And then you get the later kind of worse decisions of consenting to even worse things, out of a misguided attempt to do his job. And then just more of this kind of talking about how, their sort of MO with tempting humans and everything is to, kind of strike at God through us by, destroying the creature, because that's, what he loved into existence, and that's their kind of like petty revenge and everything. And then, far from thinking that that's a small thing, they see it as kind of like that's kind of the whole point. We've accomplished something great, is I think the line that he uses. And then at this point, he's already kind of established the point where, even though Jimmy doesn't accept it, of him he would have been convicted of murder because of the euthanasia that he okayed previously. But then we have the scene of Jimmy's about to leave, and Nefarious asked him where his girlfriend is. And we find out that the girlfriend was pregnant. The girlfriend is actually just about to go and have an abortion performed at Jimmy's request. And then we find out that it was also because he not only says that he's not ready for kids, which Nefarious mocks because he's only 35, and then also the fact that he had his eyes on another woman already. And so he was terminating the relationship and the child as a means of kind of freeing himself up for more options. So you have a lot of this kind of, even though it was very obvious before, you get more of the solidification of Jimmy as like fence sitter. And I would just kind of, before stopping here, just contrast that with, you have the warden as the neutral party, but Jimmy is the fence sitter, right? Like the warden knows his place, and yet Jimmy is coming in as kind of like the white hat, and then he's the fence sitter. And it reminds me of this joke, little allegorical joke of, there's like a guy that finds himself up sitting on top of a wall. And on one side, there's all these angels that are saying, hey, come down, we'll kind of catch you or whatever, you should come over to our side. And then behind him, you see is hell. And there's all these, demons, but they're just kind of like lying around lazily, just like scratching their back or whatever and not really caring, yawning. And he goes and he's like, he knows which way he's supposed to be going, but he turns back and he's like, hey, you devils, why are you, like, they're so interested in me. Why do you not care? And they say, oh, the fence is on our property. And it's like, yeah, that's pretty much exactly where Jimmy is at this particular point, thinking that he's in a center position, but really he's actually conceded way more ground than he thinks.
Well, yeah, and it's a good point, right? So what he's really doing is he's severing relationships, right, in order to keep his options open, which is what you have to do. And I just wanted to, and in a way, our names and meanings also a state and place. These are all separate things, right? So you've got a name. A name is a content, right? It's it's the actual content. Then you've got context, and it's the quality of the relationship between the content and the context that determines the meaning. Right? That's how sarcasm works. Right? It's very hard to be sarcastic in text because the medium can't convey the quality of the word, because usually you convey the sarcasm purely through tone.
Mark,
right?
that can't be right.
Thank you, Father. I appreciate that. And so that the state and the place, because a state happens in a place, but also the state is the overlap between the place, we'll say, that you are materially, and the place that you are, we'll say, spiritually or ethereally is the term I like to use, just to keep the science dweebs happier, right? That doesn't affect meaning. In other words, a saint can walk through hell and it's fine, right? Because the state and the place don't affect them because of the meaning that they convey due to their relationship with God, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
See also Don Bosco's Visit to Hell. The really, really interesting read, pretty short. He had like a vision that he experienced, like it was more of a kind of a dream that his guardian angel was taking him through hell. But then as proof that he had been there, his guardian angel thrust his hand against the wall and he had like 3rd-degree burns that were peeling for like 4 weeks or something like that.
Yeah, being a saint is usually unpleasant.
Yeah.
Like, stuff just keeps on happening because you're a little high up there. You're on the top of the mountain. The air is kind of thin, so sometimes just being given ordinary graces is a nice thing there. Boy, like the severing of connections to keep the options open. It's like that's like the whole demonic thing there, and. The rebellion of the demons is so that they wouldn't have to be tied to God anymore, and Like, okay, you're not tied to God anymore. That means you inevitably end up in hell. Like there really isn't another option there. It's nice to have nice thick ties to God, Mark. I can't recommend it enough. I'll just let you know that.
Oh, that's surprising. What a surprising opinion coming from you, Father Eric.
So yeah, and it's like that's kind of the image of hell that C.S. Lewis uses. It's like an eternally expanding city where people can't get along. They can make up whatever they want, but it's never of particularly good quality. And so everything's just kind of dingy and weak. Everybody's constantly fighting, and ultimately everybody ends up alone here. And you can see like this severing of like the connections that Jimmy's doing. It's like, well, you can just starve mom to death, and it's that kind of stuff happens more than you think. I wonder how many hospice nurses are going to hell. We'll see about that. And yeah, it's and then like severing the connection with the mother, and then severing the connection with the girlfriend, the child, by all of that. Maybe there's like some kind of woman trouble here. He doesn't know how to properly value and appreciate the women in his life. Because if he did, he would have cherished his mother in her last days, and he would have married this woman and then gladly welcomed a child. And like that's the appropriate relationship to mother, to wife, and like all of this disordered relationships with women. Just put in there that the writers, I'm sure, didn't actually think this through. They just know what this kind of guy does. It's amazing. It's amazing how it's like how math keeps on working no matter how you split it up. But this is even better because it's reality, not just an abstraction.
It's almost as if it's like a thing that's kind of like a what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, a pattern. That's let's call it a perennial pattern. And then the more people you meet, the more they fall into the buckets, right? And those buckets are the perennial patterns. And they take a while. Some of them take a while to see because they can take a very long time to unfold. And that's why some people will get very upset. Like, you met him and talked to him for 5 minutes, and you think you know about him, and well, some people do because they may have run into that pattern before, and they may know exactly how far along the pattern that person is and where they're going to end up, and sometimes even when, right? And the when isn't always a time frame. Sometimes it's the first time your spouse is in a serious accident or needs serious medical attention, you're going to get a divorce, sort of a thing. Because I've seen people do that, and it's happened, and I'm like, I don't know how they knew that was going to happen, but my goodness, are they good at this, right?
The first political cause that catches your attention is going to utterly enrapture you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, there's a more common, that's the NPC pattern, which all the people who cry NPCs to other people are actually the NPCs. Not saying those other people aren't also, but also, listen, if you're using the term NPC, you're self-naming.
I'm an NPC. I've been programmed by God.
Thank you, Father.
Here we go.
So once we get to this point, he goes and it becomes, revealed what's going on in the background with the girlfriend and everything. It hasn't actually happened just yet at this point, but it's like about to happen. She's in the clinic at this point. And so there's this kind of like back and forth about Jimmy not being prepared to have kids and everything. And then Nefarious goes on this like almost kind of pro-life pep talk, but it's, for evil means, of course, and goes and says, that your life could be about sacrificial love and you could marry this woman and have kids and everything. And like he's doing like the good guy thing. And then Jimmy says, I'm just not ready for all that. And then he says, he goes and just blurts out, "That's my boy." It was just so amazingly well acted. But then he goes and he sort of mocks him with the motto of this satanic temple, which is "Do what thou wilt, that is the whole of the law," And then it's just more of this kind of thing. And even says, that despite all of the all of the kind of creation and redemption and sanctification, everything that mankind is still kind of choosing himself as his own God. And then you have this exemplification of that by choosing yourself, you actually necessarily embed yourself in just basically whatever else has, more ability to strong arm you. And then he goes and he points out this thing to the point of like the hospice nurses, talks about how the priests for these sacrifices now wear surgical scrubs, and then it's at this point that Jimmy Fent sits for way too long, and then by the time he actually is able to go out and make a call, the operation has actually just been concluded. And there's even like kind of a very dramatic point where Nefarious kind of describes the situation as it's happening,
Right.
and then Jimmy just gets the confirmation of what happened, that now his girlfriend is in recovery, whereas Nefarious is talking about how all hell rejoices, and then kind of describing the pain that God feels at having kind of witnessed that because human beings willed it. And that he wouldn't kind of override our wills. But so there's a lot of this kind of recurring theme of the embeddedness of the wills, and then kind of, the consequences of, individualism, so to say, just bringing about all of the sort of emergent issues that come up.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, so Gustav's the girlfriend part was tough to watch. Yeah, it really was. And this is one of those parts, and there's a few of them in the movie, where the demon is doing something that a science bro would think is impossible, but all the evidence points that maybe he did know what was going on and feel it, and maybe hell did rejoice, right? Because the timing works, right? Unexpectedly, like Jimmy's not expecting the timing to work out. Obviously, he thinks it's all bunk, but the timing actually works, and you can see that, that creeping doubt, right? And he's doing that, contrasting, as Castle pointed out earlier, where he's saying like, no, of course, sacrificial love, blah, blah, blah. And you could just call it all off. And, there's still time, and you could get married and all this good stuff, right? But then he's, immediately switching back in, and then sucking him in. So you have this high contrast just from the demon all by himself. He doesn't, he knows what he's doing. He's been at this for a while, and it works. Like ultimately, it works because it not only puts doubt, in the mind of the viewer, but it clearly puts doubt in the framework of the science, which is the whole goal of this. Which is why I think this is better apologetics than you're ever going to find from any of these so-called apologists, because the movie, for however this happened, really understands what's at issue. It's not an argument over timing and material and logic and reason and rationality. That is not where the fight is. If that's where you are, you're playing the role of the demon for real. Don't do that. There's better ways to approach this, which it is highlighted, I would say, and mostly highlighted by its absence. But it gets highlighted in other ways in the film would be my argument.
And it also, it's a Jimmy listening to this is just like a great image of spiritual blindness.
Yep.
Like he could have gotten to the end of Nefarious's speech of, this is what your life could be, and been like, you're right. And at that moment, maybe he could have changed his child's life, like it'd be tight, who knows? But he's just like blind to the goodness right there. And this idea that Nefarious has been working on Jimmy for a while, it's like, yeah, like Nefarious knew that speech, which if delivered, let's say, by a trustworthy person, should have really lit a young man's heart on fire, or even an older man's heart on fire for a courageous life of self-sacrifice. But he had already worked on it enough to know where that would fall on blind eyes and deaf ears. So just a brilliant way that they've got this all set up in the movie.
Absolutely. Yeah, Well, I also wanted to say we are currently 7 pages in, 4 pages left, so we're moving along pretty well.
And then, just the again, really, we can Sean Patrick Flannery, the name of the actor who's playing Edward and Nefarious, really like captures just kind of like the demonic mocking, parodying joy of hell in destruction. And like that's all that demons are left with at the end, is like they can only rejoice in destruction because they've cut themselves off from creation. They're not capable of participating in creation anymore. All they can do is go about destroying things. So it's a well-made point.
And it's like that thing with, even in terms of joy or pleasure that they get, it's kind of like, things like envy or whatever sort of thing, where it's just like, ultimately, it's still like a self-destructive sort of pleasure, where it's like, well, it is and actually so fleeting to the point of like instantaneously being gone, or maybe even gone while in pursuit of it, right? Like it never actually happens. And so it's just like this kind of endless cycle of just like hateful addiction. And then to that point, so we get to the point in the movie, which Mark and I talked about this just a little bit, is possibly the most evil thing that Nefarious does in the entire movie, even more than getting the one guy to kill himself and putting Edward in the electric chair, and that is canceling Edward's meal order, which is just so extremely cruel. I mean, obviously the other things are worse, but the way that it's done is, Edward is there allowed to be kind of unpossessed to give his meal order, and he just asks for like a cheeseburger and a chocolate shake, and he stammers it out, and he's like on the verge of crying, knowing that he's a few hours from death. And he says, "This is really important to me." And as soon as the guy taking his order goes away, Nefarious takes over and says, "Actually, cancel that. I'm not hungry." And just, it's the most evil thing, that even more than breaking his fingers, right? Like just all of the stuff was just, I'm going to kill this guy and give him nothing.
It doesn't serve Nefarious's plan anymore. Like all this other stuff that he's doing, that serves his plan. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of nasty, but he's got this goal for it. Canceling the meal order is just mean. It doesn't. Yeah. All it serves to do is to just further torment Edward.
Well, and Edward too. Like, I don't know how he acted this so well. You could tell that was the thing that meant the most to him in the world, was that order. And all he wanted was some care in that order being delivered to him, because he seemingly has no hope. Like he understands, no, this is it. Like nothing, that we're done, right? And so it's really, that was my least favorite part of the movie. That was the part of the movie where I was like, really? Like, who did this? I'm gonna have some words with this person. I was like, that's no one should write such a thing. This is up there with killing the dog in the movie for me. Like, no one should do this ever. This should be forbidden by humans in perpetuity, right? It just really, that really got to me, like unbelievably.
Yeah. It was really rough. And then, so after that, then we kind of go, you have the bursting of the light bulb, and then you have the powering on of the generator for the electric chair. And so despite all the foreshadowing and stuff, including the sizzle and all these different things, Jimmy still hasn't actually grasped the fact that this guy not only truly does want to be killed, or, that something wants him dead, and in the most painful way possible. And that, and he even goes and kind of explicitly says, he jokes like, "Oh, I chose it because I don't like needles," which is just like the most ridiculous reason ever. And then points out again, I'm just doing it to punish him. So you just kind of have those layers on there. I don't know. Did you want to mention, Mark, the kind of
Yeah.
like brief history of the electric chair?
Yeah, so the electric chair has the most interesting and demonic history of anything. Forget about the guillotine, man. Like, the guillotine's bad and stuff, and it destroyed the world in so many ways.
But it's efficient and quick.
It was efficient and quick. It's the first sort of instance of this, right? You can just look at hardcore history, painfotainment, like unbelievable. You'll figure out real quick from listening to that how evil the guillotine is. But the electric chair is worse because the electric chair is the result of an argument over a commercialization of a technology. That's all it is. It's part of the battle, the so-called battle of the currents, which was allegedly between Edison and Tesla, although that's not entirely accurate. Thomas Edison invents the electric chair, never like as a demonstration of the dangers of alternating current, and therefore does not ever want this used. Not only does he not want the chair used, he doesn't want alternating current to exist because he's the direct current camp. That's his thing with his patents, right? He doesn't want the Westinghouse patents, which were originally Tesla's patents, to be used, for commercial purposes, or more importantly, for ego purposes. And everybody beneath him, effectively, because Edison's a great man by any possible standard, I'll say. They just follow along with, "Oh yeah, look at this. This is a great way to kill people," even though there's no way to come to that conclusion based on the brutality of the thing. And it always takes more than one hit, pretty much, and you have to do all these special things. Like, originally they put their feet in water and stuff. It's completely insane. And so the fact that it was adopted is sort of demonstrative of the failure of science and how utterly evil science strays into almost immediately, right? And technology as such. And again, it's not about that electrocutes you. It's more about the technology of alternating current versus direct current, right? It's all of that wrapped up in this. And I thought, again, whether or not the author knew what was going on here, how deep the symbolism went, I can't comment. But wow, is that sort of demonstrative of what's going on, we'll say in the wider story.
So it's at this point that we get kind of like the last major dialogue before kind of the characters get separated, and then we kind of get to closer to the conclusion, or maybe you could say kind of the climax of the execution, because it's pretty quick. It's not necessarily like, okay, we're going to crescendo into a particular thing. It's like you get the climax and the ending are pretty back to back, but you have more of this kind of dialogue about, Jimmy still has a lot of this relativism. So he's saying, "Oh, we've moved past, the concepts of good and evil, these sorts of things."
I was so cringe when he's giving that talk.
Yeah, no, it was just terrible.
Yeah,
but so well acted, right? Like he delivered it like someone that believed it.
It's like he spent all day on Reddit before giving that talk.
Yeah, just awful. And he goes and he gives this thing of, we're the literacy, like that's one of the major things that he points out. And then Nefarious goes on to just shut down everything he has, saying high school graduates have a 6th grade reading level and all these different things, and the sheer amount of slaves compared to the height of the Roman Empire, and how half of them are sex slaves, and all these horrible things. And then goes on to talk about the influence of the media and how he's been kind of desensitized from everything from TV and music and movies and all these different things. So, kind of destroying the world with the power of story almost, which is very much kind of in contrast with what a lot of people are kind of trying to do. But then he goes and kind of this is also kind of the completion of his background of salvation history and these sorts of things, saying that the cross was the greatest mistake, but that they still had the sort of opportunity of the individualism of man being still therein, and their way to kind of subvert the fact that, in his words, God cheated to get around, their plans, which they had, set up and everything. But that, he even goes and says, was it the thing of that hate speech was something that humans, made up, and that, that
we
old concept.
we didn't have to help you with that one. You came up with that all on your own.
Yeah,
All on
He
your
says,
own, right?
sometimes you even surprise even us. It's
That was great.
So yeah, and then just kind of mentions this thing of like, well, the price of redemption is that kind of subordination of the will, or more so just kind of reciprocation, like just gratitude actually is maybe even just kind of an easier way of framing it, and yet people don't. And then you have this kind of separation where now he goes and the warden says, he sends his guys in, says, okay, you got to come and see this. They discover in Edward's room that there is a completely written manuscript. So one thing I kind of failed to mention in this thing is that Nefarious calls out in the beginning the whole plan that he's going to write his book, that Jimmy is going to be the author of the book that is going to be kind of his dark gospel. And by introducing yet another story into the world, he's going to subvert even more, the kind of process of redemption and sanctification. And so, that his execution in the electric chair especially is going to be almost like his sort of his scapegoat moment, almost, and kind of like Girardian terms, and that people were going to kind of come to see his way. And so they discovered this manuscript. And what I found interesting is, so, you have the warden who clearly he just wants this to kind of be over with and everything. They've probably been dealing with this guy for years. And he's at this point really pressuring and even kind of using means that he normally didn't in the other interactions to kind of pressure Jimmy into being fearful for his own life. Even saying like, well, if he's not executed, then eventually he'll go back with the regular population of inmates. And it's like, well, he's in prison for life, but he kind of insinuates like, well, he's going to break out and one day you're going to wake up and he's going to be at the foot of your bed, which is a bit of a leap, probably also not necessarily inaccurate. But he presents this stuff. And one thing I thought was interesting is that throughout the movie, when there are these separations and Jimmy leaves the scene, and comes back, a lot of times Nefarious is kind of sitting upright, sometimes even in almost like a feminine sort of cross-leg sort of way, very kind of mocking. But I think it's when he comes back from this one, Edward is asleep, or he's got like his head down or something like that. There's something to do with that, and I don't know. There's just the point that was made previously about when he's not with Edward, he's with Jimmy. And, how he's already established that he's influencing other people around. And to your point of every time there's a desire to kind of deviate from the plan of executing him, he intervenes. So, just to kind of propose that, yeah, there was a little bit of influence in there. Still not necessarily wrong on the part of the warden, but he also has no additional discernment outside of his structure.
Right. Well, and it's important to point out, too, there's two manuscripts found. One is a scrapbook of Jimmy's life,
right?
Like a detail with pictures and everything. And the other one is this manuscript that he's going to write, to tell for the dark gospel or whatever. And that's part of the whole plan that Jimmy is not, he's just like, this is ridiculous, right? This is insane. And so again, it was said sort of very early on that this is going to happen, and then much later in the movie towards the end we find the book, right? And so it's a double twist in some sense, because he told them the truth, right, in a very careful way, because the other thing about this movie, the language is fairly precise. Like, it's pretty spot on. I don't want to say it's perfect, but it's fairly precise. And so if you don't listen carefully, you won't notice, no, I didn't say you were going to kill 3 people when you got here. I said you're going to have been responsible for 3 murders right? So things like that. And then this idea of he's been watching you, right, just reinforces the, oh, well, when I'm not with him, I'm with you, right? And so you get more and more of a sense that the fix is in, that determinism is real, at least with respect to the demon, right? And so that's super important, in my opinion, is the way it unfolds to provide you with this evidence over and over again in layers over time, because that's how these things work. They work over time. It's not one transgression and a big boom. It's one transgression and a small slide that you can't stop. Small but slow slide.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's important as well with the sort of determinism from that perspective thing, is that it's like, well, you have extreme pattern recognition plus thousands of years of experience, right? And also hands-on experience with these specific people. And then and the fact that the entire pattern and all of the interactions are being tampered with kind of behind the scenes through these like subtle influences and stuff. So it's like, yeah, that is definitely, it's a lot more tampering than you would experience on a human level. And you also get the thing. So this was something that I looked up on my second watch through, was that when he goes and he drops this book with the scrapbook of Jimmy's life and wakes up Edward, now Nefarious, he like, there's childhood photos and stuff, but they're like not his family's photos. And so he even goes and says, "That's my first picture of you." And so we've established that the character of Jimmy is 35 years old. And the actor Sean Patrick Flannery is like 59. So it's actually very like realistically plausible that yes, there was actually either a teenage or 20-ish year old Edward who actually took these photographs himself while possessed as a young man. And that now we've got decades of additional, serial killer stuff that's been, going on. That his subjugation was very early. And because Edward himself, even in his desperation, it doesn't necessarily seem like he would lie at a point like this. I mean, maybe he could in his desperation, but, kind of saying that, yeah, there's things that he's done that he didn't want to do and stuff, but that so many of these actual murders and stuff are not things that he himself consented to. And so then we get to this point where, in order to finally coerce Jimmy into signing off on the execution, Edward breaks a bunch of his fingers to be able to slip out of the cuffs, and then uses the chain to strangle Jimmy. Which, why the guards didn't immediately pounce on him, they hesitated for dramatic effect. We had to get the exposition and everything, and they knew that. So. But then after that point, just kind of out of fear and the near-death experience, which is another kind of false intimacy that gets kind of presented there too, of like, oh, we've never been closer. He says something to that effect. Well, he's literally strangling him. And then, lets himself get beaten by the guards, and then Jimmy signs off on his execution. Right. I'll pause there if anybody.
Yeah, well, I just want to add about the point about intimacy, right? It's true on multiple levels. We've never been closer because you've never been closer to death, and you're coming to my realm anyway. And we've never been closer, say, materially or physically. And that's the sort of, we'll say, self-similarly fractal truth that matters. And again, this is why I think this movie is so much better than a Christian apologist trying to do the silly Christian apology game where they're playing with the propositions and saying, and therefore, rather than, demonstrating through acts. And I also want to add sort of, to my earlier point about sliding down, sliding a little bit at a time. I think that's probably, and of course this is Father Eric's wheelhouse. That's probably why you need to keep going to confession, right? Because you're constantly sliding down that ramp,
It's
you
like
need to constantly compensate.
every time you start, liturgy of the hours, God, come to my assistance. It's just like several times a day. You're like, help me, I'm gonna fall. Like you got to keep on coming here. That's why we have this constant, stream of prayer coming out of the church because it's just going to start sliding. You take away their face and they die, returning to the dust from which they came. You send forth your spirit, and they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. That's a pattern of creation, and it's also a pattern of redemption, right?
Yeah.
That constant. So, like every mass, we begin, guys. I confess that I messed up. I messed up. I messed up. Yeah. And then once a month, formally doing it a confession.
Yeah, I think that is definitely really important. Is kind of like recognizing the ease with which you can kind of fault. Like, it was the prayer of Saint Philip Neri, where like this guy was really high level and everything, and like his prayer was, God preserve Philip because Philip will betray you if you don't. And it's just like that's pretty much he knew. Like he fully recognized he was operating at an extremely high level, and he's just like, yeah, I can crash and burn. And actually, any second, like I really just need help constantly. And that is one of those things that that for all of the hype that there is over exorcisms and stuff, there's still technically a sacramental, which is lower than the sacrament of confession. So a lot of the times, like these exorcisms are not exclusively, but a lot of times they're for people who don't have access, or don't have, formation or the. Sometimes it happens, right?
From what I've heard is that there's a lot of people who like come to exorcist, but still want the benefits they get from communion with demons.
Yeah.
And they're like, and they kind of, they got some backsliding too, where like they get tormented for the demons by the while. They go to the exorcist, and the exorcist say, okay, stop doing seances, and then they're good for a couple weeks, and then they backslide again. It just sounds exhausting. Yeah. But yes, Monsignor Esif, one good confession is worth more than 1,000 exorcisms. So,
yeah. But yeah, so after this point, I think we pretty much cut away from their direct interactions for the most part, the rest of the movie, at least kind of the two of them isolated. And so we have a little bit of kind of dialogue with the warden and Jimmy, and the warden has been kind of during breaks providing cigarettes to Jimmy because of the stress, and that's kind of part of his usual pattern with when he has people that have to do evaluations and stuff. And he makes this line that he says, sometimes the man you execute isn't the man that came in here. But then he also says, well, this isn't that case. But in a certain sense, like in one sense it isn't, but also it kind of is, like,
right.
But for the purposes of his job, again, he's doing what he's supposed to be doing.
But Castle, I mean, it's exactly correct, right? Because what the warden is talking about is people change, right? But what's happened is Edward's possessed by a demon, and so in essence, he's absolutely correct that the man hasn't changed. That is true. That is 100% true. Edward's still this innocent, childlike pawn of the demon. And that never changed the whole time he was in prison. And I think that's actually understanding it that way is a good exemplification of the difference between having an understanding of the fact that there's a material and a spiritual, or a material and ethereal, versus not understanding that, because otherwise that neutral condition doesn't make any sense, right? Because there's really three states, right? You have somebody come in and not change and still be a bad person and need to get executed. You can have somebody come in and change and maybe, like, what else are we going to do? The machine has to do what the machine does. And then the third one is possession, right? And so now you have the contrast to see the full, people would call it nuance, or I would call it level of detail required to understand what's going on here, right? Yes, there is something materially that looks like possession and isn't, but also there's possession, right? That's kind of an important thing to recognize, so that you can when you're confronted with evil, you can actually make it out. Because otherwise, if it's just good and evil, right, it's just two points of contrast, you'll never be able to tell the difference. It'll all just fade to gray, and people will get caught in the, well, this is less evil, that's more evil, like the relativism happens automatically.
Mm. And I think just one kind of interesting thing about this, you have the death row inmate, and to kind of contrast this with historically, like I remember this one example. It was like during the medieval era, there was this guy he was like a highwayman, and everybody in this town knew, like, yeah, this guy, he was like the worst possible Robin Hood, just like aggravated assault, would batter people and steal their stuff and everything. Not sure if he actually killed anyone, but eventually he found himself in a church. He was struck with conversion. I think he even went in there to steal something. And then as he was struck with conversion, somebody saw him, called the authorities, they apprehended him, and then the next morning they were just going to execute him. Because he was just such a problem, and everyone knew. And then he goes, and because he was struck with conversion and everything, and they give the opportunities and stuff, because it's like, well, okay, we got to take care of
This
you.
is a Catholic society. You wouldn't sentence somebody to death without having a priest there. That's like, you can kill somebody, but like sending them to hell on purpose?
Right. Yeah. And so he goes, and he makes his confession and everything, and then also even publicly, expresses contrition for everything that he did. And then they actually go and they say, well, no one's ever actually like reacted that way. So we'll give you like some resources. Like, you can't live here, but you can live somewhere else. And like, we'll give you some resources.
We'll downgrade you to exile.
Yeah. And he said, no, I have to, like, this is in a sense, my temporal punishment, and also you have to set the example of like, yes, I had my conversion, I did my confession, like, I'm good, but also for the good of the town, you have to kind of take care of this. Whereas you have the contrast with now this prison where, the priest was not available until the sizzle. They didn't keep him. They didn't have another guy or anything like that. They didn't call him back. And then he's just kind of, now they read him his letter. He also, like, he didn't even know at this point that his meal had been canceled. Like, that was also one of the worst things. He finds out right before his execution he's not getting his meal. And then he's they read him, the order from the governor and everything. They pull him over, and then they have the people in the viewing room there to witness the execution. And Jimmy is conveniently seated right next to the detective who apprehended Edward. Took him 6 years of investigative work. Totally not perfectly coordinated by Nefarious being able to watch where the detective was at all times and evade escape. And also the fact that you're not allowed to even have, even though the warden has his own cigarettes, you're not allowed to bring cigarettes or weapons or anything like that into the prison. But this detective was, even though still law enforcement, was allowed to have a loaded firearm on his hip inside the execution viewing chamber, and which was totally locked. We get, a little bit more of this kind of back and forth of Nefarious taking over, mocking, making statements. Even this thing of like, you've been measured and found wanting, in tongues and everything, and then allowing Edward to actually experience the entirety of the execution. I did skip the part where he gets his haircut. This is actually where we meet the smartest person in the movie. And so he's brought to get his haircut because they have to be able to get a proper connection with the nodes or what have you. And hair is a resistor. So they give him a bald cut. And the barber there goes and looks at him and says, there's nothing that you've done, even being a serial killer, not having seen any of the conversations before, that can't be forgiven, which is totally true. Like, the only unforgivable sin is the one that you refuse to confess, whether that's, by, arrogance or presumption or despair or whatever that is. And Nefarious is in charge of the body at this point, so he makes some, some clever quips about, these things that were referenced in Shakespeare being like his own actions and stuff. And then we get let me see here. Yeah, so then you have just the horrible death of Edward. So he gets fried in the electric chair. Absolutely terrible. But I did want to mention something that, the pridefulness of the demon is that they tend to overplay their hand, especially like pushing Edward that much. And also the fact that we see, okay, he didn't truly consent to a lot of these things. He consented to some things and then that escalated. It was enough to be a problem. But, you have just like the continued severe abuse, especially at the end of his life. And there's even a point where Jimmy asks him before signing off on the execution thing, before Nefarious takes over, and he says, is there, like, what could I do? Is there anything that I could do to help you? And it seemed like he was going to say, like, call the priest back or call another one or something, like just do anything. And Nefarious takes back over really quick. So you have these kind of hints of like repentance in the guy himself, and then Nefarious boasting, oh yeah, this the execution is going to be like a foretaste of hell and everything. Couldn't think of anything better except for execution by crucifixion, but that wasn't on the menu. And these things, but you take these examples of like within a little over 100 years ago, you have Saint Therese of Lisieux, where she heard that there was someone on death row in her town, that, or roughly in the same vicinity. And she said like the entire week that she was like, no, this is my intention, that this guy's he's still gonna get executed, but he's gonna convert, because he was a killer and notoriously hated Christianity, right? So it's like, okay, this guy's the project for the next 7 days until the execution. And she said, like whatever happens, even if I never hear about it, I'm gonna be 100% certain that this guy had a chance. And then the next time the newspapers came in, she gets a copy of the newspaper, and it said that right before he was executed, he saw that someone was wearing a crucifix around their neck, asked for it, repented, kissed the crucifix, and then consented to his execution. And it's like, well, that, is a major kind of turnaround for a guy that just hated everything, was ready to go to hell. And so, much more so is the potential here for this fictional character who, is obviously just completely messed up by the end of the movie and is, looking for any kind of out. So, so you at least have that. And then as soon as the execution happens, there's this kind of introduction of, oh, Jimmy feels something a little bit odd in him, and then hears Nefarious's voice despite seeing the dead body in front of him. And then immediately, involuntarily grabs the handgun from the detective, points it at everyone, and then points it at himself. And just after saying, like, please God help me, just kind of barely squeaked out, he pulls the trigger 3 times, and then is tackled, and then it cuts to black before the ending. And I'll stop talking there.
Yeah, it's like, well, that's interesting, isn't it? I thought Nefarious's plan was to have Jimmy write this book, but the second, like he goes for the gun, like what's that all about? And it's, if I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, so let's see what you guys think of this. But if Jimmy was supposed to be the bearer of this false gospel, well, the bearer of the true gospel himself was executed next to a criminal. And so this is like maybe an attempt at an inversion of Christianity, and then there'd be some maybe arrangement where the story of the scrapbook and then the manuscript would get out, and then that would be kind of the means of propagation. This dramatic scene of the suicide in the viewing chamber. So I don't know. That's got to be the case. Like I can't figure out how else to make sense of the movie. But this is just an inversion of crucifixion, I suppose.
Well, for sure,
Yeah.
Plan B, right? I mean, because he never consented to doing the book, and so it's
Right.
like, well, the whole point of the execution was to get you to now be my pawn, and then he doesn't consent
But
to it. So it's like,
he's got the possession now. He's got the possession now.
Yeah, exactly. So he could just coerce him. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it doesn't matter what he consents to at this point. Yeah.
Right, but I think what it is in order for the execution to get the fame and fortune needed to do what he said, something dramatic that isn't the execution, which is only witnessed by like 12 people, needs to happen. Right? It can't just be a report. Right? It's got to be some catalyst has to draw people's attention to this thing, and then has to draw people's attention also to Jimmy, right? Because otherwise, who's going to read the damn book anyway? And so, yeah, there's this inversion, and of course, it has to be, dramatic and realistic enough to get the attention of pretty much everybody, right, including Jimmy himself. But also, it's a play to the audience. Like, no. This possession, here it is. It worked. He invited him in, right? And then he got there, right? It's done. And he has total control over life and death, right? Like I control the life of your body now for sure, right? So that's actually, that's actually, I think, important. And you could argue, reasonably so, that in order to tell a good story, that would have to have happened in some form. Right, which would be my argument. Like, there's no, like, the movie would make any sense if you didn't do that part, right? If you didn't have a temporary or partial possession at that moment, the rest of it wouldn't function.
Because otherwise, Jimmy'd be right. Like, oh, I invited you in and nothing happened. Like, what's the big deal?
Right, but even if that wasn't true, and he tried to publish the book, no one would have heard of this guy. No one would have looked at that book. No one. I mean, he said, like, this execution is my way of, inverting what actually happened with Jesus, right? Well, okay, but then who would hear about this if he didn't, if that incident didn't happen? Who would have? Why would this be interesting to anybody? Who even would have known? Right? Nobody would have known anything untoward had happened. It would be a normal event.
Yeah. So you get this whole thing where, the manuscript is already, it's already named after him. Like, it's not really necessary for him to necessarily be alive. Since it's just in people's hands, it would be in custody and everything. And so we wind up then kind of cutting to probably about a year later, or maybe a little longer, that he's now hanging out with Glenn Beck in the studio doing an interview about the release of his new book. And so there's a little bit of this kind of discussion of what we just witnessed in the previous scene. And then Glenn Beck kind of asks him, okay, well, you go and the demon wanted you to get this book out. And then here it is. Right. And you'd say, like, are you still under its influence? Like, are you sure that you're not doing its will? And he immediately says no. We already know that his discernment is not good. But, we also have the fact that it's like, okay, yeah, he literally called out for God and didn't die when the trigger was pulled 3 times. Like, he was supposed to die. And then even in the report after the fact, they say that there were 3 distinct dents in the primer from the firing pin, that it had actually been struck 3 times, and then when they loaded it up and fired it themselves, there was no problem with firing it. And so clearly he was saved by a miracle. But then Glenn Beck kind of asked him frankly, like, oh, are you a believer or anything? And he says, well, I wouldn't go that far. It's like, dude, after all this, right? And you still spent all that time editing. Like, I edited Mark's book. Let me tell you, it takes a few months. Like, that's a decent amount of, and how easy was that then, that he's saying, oh, I'm not under its influence or anything like that anymore. Like, really, it was that easy for you? And he went and he said, okay, I sort of subverted it. I changed some of the things to turn it into a warning as opposed to like an instruction or anything like that. And they would say, yeah, are you certain that you didn't just fall into a trap? Because that was pretty easy. Like, it was able to take over your body and make you almost shoot yourself, and then you had no more problems with getting this out. And yeah, you found someone to print it for you and everything, and that didn't give you any problems or anything, because we've encountered that. And so there's all of these different things that are going on, and they sort of Glenn Beck kind of congratulates him and still promotes the book and everything, and it's sort of we'll see how this actually works. One, if anyone actually buys it, also, why is this extra information going to help? And are you sure this wasn't the plan the entire time? And then he leaves the studio, and then sees a homeless person digging through the garbage, decides to give some money, and then the homeless person acknowledges him by name and then changes voice to Nefarious, greeting him. And then that's the end of the movie. So that's pretty much where we're left as far as screen time goes.
I didn't really like the ending.
I was up in the air on the ending until I talked to Castle about it, and then I was like, oh no, I think I see what's going on here. It's just really, I think the ending's actually just really deep and complex, for that reason, right? Because technically, if he doesn't edit the manuscript, then he didn't write the book. And the interesting thing is, and I've been over this in a previous live stream. Actually, it was last week's live stream, or maybe the week before, my Friday live streams. If I tell you not to think about a teddy bear, that's not a function you can perform. The minute I say don't think about a teddy bear, you put a teddy bear in your mind and try to exercise it out of your mind. But in order to do that, you have to know what a teddy bear is, and so it reappears. That's basically what happens. And so, in some sense, there's no such thing as a warning against evil, because when you point at evil, your attention is drawn towards it automatically. And so it's the pointing carefully and not often is the only way for these things to say. In other words, saying X is bad, some number of people are going to do X. The bad part never enters into the brain because their attention gets drawn to it. And so in some sense, you can't write a warning against evil in that way, because it's the same as telling you not to think about a teddy bear. Whatever you do, don't think about a teddy bear. I want you not to think about that teddy bear. It doesn't work. You can't function that way.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, the fact is, what would stop anyone from just taking the PDF of his ebook or something like that, and then just cutting out all of his commentary and then re-releasing it, with a new title, right, or something like that, and then just publishing it better, doing a better job of promoting it, or targeting it to very specific people or something, or even with the commentary, like that, just kind of go through it, like you said, once it enters into the intellect and the memory and stuff, and it's like, well, now you can just be tempted into the stuff now that you didn't realize was a problem.
Right.
And so there is that thing of like, well, he didn't, his kind of strategy for dealing with the thing that tried to shoot him in the face 3 times with his own hand, was to go on offense with no defense, and then say, well, and then remain fence sitting for this time, and then just kind of the very kind of in your face presence of, hey, by the way, like, here I am. I knew exactly where you were the entire time, and I was waiting for you. Thanks for the cash. Like, that's pretty much what he's kind of left with at the end. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of thing that, and I said this before kind of on the Discord, it's the type of ending that Jimmy would pick. And so in a certain sense, yes, it's a dumb ending, but also that's exactly what he would have done. And so, yeah, it should be dissatisfying, because everything else he's done for the entire movie has been pretty dissatisfying, I think, to the audience. So
yeah, in essence, he's feckless and a puppet, and he can't enact his will in the world. and the ending is part of demonstrating that, right? And he's arrogant, so he says, I took the book and I rewrote it as a warning, ha ha, because I'm not possessed. That was and he doesn't address it, like, but you were possessed, like, right? And Glenn Beck does a good job of sort of highlighting that in a neutral fashion, like, yeah, but it did happen, and he just sort of sloughs it off, like, well, not really, because I wrote a warning. I made his book into a warning instead, right? And so it's that exemplification of arrogance, right? That proves that he's a puppet. I mean, that's what makes you a puppet, is thinking you know who the NPC is. Really? It's that, oh, you're so smart, huh? You know who the NPC is.
I
Oh,
confess that I am an NPC.
There you go.
If you don't consider that you're a Muppet, then you will be a puppet, and that's just kind of how it goes.
Well, and if you need help with that, you can just get a mug, and that'll help. That'll definitely help. You can go to shop.markofwisdom.org and get a mug, and remind yourself every day with your morning beverage that you're a Muppet.
Oh, man, I do believe this conversation lasted longer than the movie itself.
It did, by 30 minutes. Yeah. We did it, guys.
We did it.
Congratulations. Thank you, Castle.
Thank you. Should we do closing thoughts, or?
Yeah. Let's go ahead and do some closing thoughts. I think maybe, Castle, you should go last.
Yeah.
I'll go first, and then Father Eric, and then you can close us out. I mean, for me, this movie did such a good job of showing the paucity, the utter silliness of the attempt to argue materialistically or through propositions with the atheist position and against the spiritual position. Like it, and in some sense, it cannot work, right? You can't logic, reason, and rationality your way out of the logic, reason, and rationality trap that leads you to the demons. Like, it's just, or straight to hell or something. You can't do it. It won't function ever. It's a flat no. And so you need to have those upgraded tools. And I thought this movie showed, once you're trapped in the closed world of propositions, you're pretty much doomed, until you step out of that in some fashion. What the movie doesn't show you, and fair enough, how would you do that in a movie, is how to get out, right? I mean, there's enough hints in there that you should be able to figure it out, dummy. But it doesn't. It's not, trying to exemplify that. It is, in essence, trying to act as a warning by showing you there is no warning. Like, when you're under the control of powers and principalities, you're under the control of powers and principalities, and your only choice is which ones, right? And what degree of control. And so that's what I thought was, especially, we'll say, brilliant about this particular movie. Father, what are your closing thoughts?
I think it's just really important to remember that we believe in God. We believe in his son, Jesus Christ. And as a result of that, we acknowledge the existence of the devil, and we contend with him as we're expected to. And we remember that it isn't really a fair fight between Jesus and the devil. Jesus will win every time, and not to, be scared. Just be prepared. And if you're prepared, everything's going to be fine. There'll be some bumpy patches. There'll be some trouble along the way, but the Lord will keep you safe through all of this, because, if you draw near to him, if you participate in the life of the church and in the life of the sacraments of the church, regular prayer, then you belong to him, and he will be, in a certain sense, jealous over you, and you won't be snatched out of his hand. So don't be scared. Be prepared. Jesus can triumph over all of these powers and principalities.
Excellent, Father. And just before I hand it over to Castle, If you're struggling with that, or you think you should be struggling with that and you're not doing so, is there like some place you recommend that we go for help with that situation?
Nearest Catholic church.
Perfect. You guys just absolutely do not advertise yourselves well enough. It's like that silly book I can never remember the name of because it has a short one-word title and no author associated. So it's very difficult to remember. Castle, close us out with your closing thoughts.
I think more closing exemplification, because your guys' thoughts were pretty spot on. Since this was about identity and relationship very much, to preserve the nature of the relationship, Father, would you give us your blessing to close us
Sure.
out?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, thank you for sending us Jesus Christ, your Son, who conquers all powers and principalities by the blood of his cross. And we humbly prostrate ourselves before you in our hearts. We ask you to come into our lives, to be our Lord, to be our King, to be our Savior, and to hold on to us, to make sure that we do not fall away in any way, that we would never do anything that would displease you or be in rebellion against your good and loving yoke over us. So we ask you, Heavenly Father, especially to, as we've spoken about evil, to protect everybody who's engaged in this stream, whether directly or indirectly, from any demonic retaliation, to render all demons impotent and paralyzed in dealing with us. And in place of any demonic presence, send your Holy Spirit upon us. Send your mother to intercede for us. Send all the angels and saints to accompany us in everything that we do. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Father. Thank you, Castle. Excellent work. And hope to see you soon, either on Father Eric Seitz channel or on Navigating Patterns. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and take this movie seriously. It will help you.